evening, and thank you for joining us for this very special episode of Sunday Inspiration. You'll see I've got joining me today my husband, Pastor Jermaine, and my son, Elijah Nichols, because some of you may be like us and just having a hard time feeling inspired based on what's going on, especially the situation that's happening in Minnesota. And so I thought today's episode would be a little bit different. Instead of having someone that I interviewed and asked questions, we thought we'd let you into our house just a little bit so that you can kind of hear the conversations that we're having, what we're telling, how we are dealing with the situation, and just our thoughts around what should possibly happen next. So we're just going to go ahead on and get right into it. So Pastor Jay, what's your thoughts about the current situation?
Well, my thoughts, like they are unfortunately when this has happened before, my thoughts go all over the place. I think about the congregation of greaterworkscenter. I think about all the pain that people are dealing with. But my thoughts primarily went to Elijah because I want him to live in a world where this doesn't happen for him. This type of thing, being victims of police violence has been the pandemic of my life. All of my 46 years, and I'm the same age as George Floyd, and I've lived with this all my life. This is every black person, especially black men's, personal pandemic. And so for my life, I've been waiting for a cure and hoping that this wouldn't happen, and hoping that this would be fixed somehow, that hearts would get fixed, and that my son would not have to endure this throughout his life. As I said in the sermon earlier, I've been teaching him how to drive, and at the end of every driving lesson, I come around as if I'm a police officer, and I question him, and I interrogate him, and I say some things that aren't natural for me to say to him, hoping that it will somehow prepare him. But knowing that if somebody has hatred or anger in their heart, there's nothing I can do. No matter how obedient he is, there's nothing I can do that could keep him from that kind of a situation. And so my heart is heavy for the fact that this might have to carry for another generation. So that's where my thoughts kind of are for every young black man, for every black woman like Sandra Bland, that my heart is so heavy that this is still possible.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I think when I first saw the video, and of course my initial reaction was anger, but I think my first reaction was disbelief, right? Like, how can in 2020 this still be allowed and to still happen? How can it still happen? My second thought immediately, and it's so interesting that you said your thoughts go to Elijah, but my thoughts actually go to both of you, because to your point, you're around his age, and every time you go out, there is a thing in the back of my mind that says, I know when he goes out, he's going to do the right stuff. He's going to, if he gets pulled over, he'll comply. But that doesn't seem to be enough, right? Because even when you do, you could be faced with the same fate. And so it is terrifying for me to to have that in the back of my mind every time you go out. And I think when situations like this happen and we get to see it live and we get to see it, on Facebook, on the media, this is a constant reminder of where we are as a society.
And so that's, that leads to my question for Elijah. I've been telling you this stuff, telling you how to be careful, how to obey if you come in contact with a police officer. And when you hear about it happening again, I wonder, are you just getting used to it? Does it bother you? What do you think when you hear about this?
Well, when I first heard about stuff like this happening, I was around 10 years old. And it really did scare me for a very long time. Up until last year, to be honest. Where it just kind of was like, oh, this is happening again. What else is new? Honestly.
Do you and your friends talk about it? Is this something that teenagers, especially young black teenagers, something that's on your mind?
Well, the ones I've met, not really, but I've heard about other black teens, standing up for civil rights nowadays. I want to be one of them, but
but it's kind of hard to know, how do you start? What do you do at your age?
And who do I talk to, since at my school not many people really focus on that. It's like, oh, this happened this week. They make a joke about it, and then they move on.
Yeah, so you guys kind of move on. It's kind of been hearing news stories about young people dying, not just black people, young black children, but the school shootings and all of that. It's kind of been the soundtrack. Those types of news stories are the soundtrack of their lives, and that is so disheartening that we can't do better, that we won't do better. So it's sad because, again, as I said earlier in the sermon, I've taught myself to wear a mask that says, don't be too aggressive, it might threaten people. Don't be too intelligent, they might think you're uppity. I've worn this mask, and one of the saddest realities for me as a black father is having to teach my son to wear that mask, and fearing that he'll have to teach his children. And so that's the heaviness that we kind of live with.
Yeah. So how do you think how do we, especially as children of God, right? You want to love, and we are taught love and grace. In situations like this, what are your thoughts around how do we move forward? Because I guess as I'm thinking about it, we've seen it before, right? We've heard this, the cop has been arrested, but we've also been at arrests before and not gotten to a resolution. So the thing that I'm hoping that doesn't happen is that this is the thing that we focus on for the next week, next 2 weeks, and then we're back to the next, Facebook or TikTok challenge, like nothing ever happened, and then until the next time. So I guess for me, I would love to figure out how do we get to a point where there isn't a next time, that we figure out the things to do so that we can stop this from happening to anybody's kid ever again. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's why I delayed in responding. And I saw a lot of my fellow pastors, and God bless them, they immediately took to social media and they began to talk about the anger and the rage, and we've been here before.
Yeah.
And so for me, I wanted to really hear people, because one of the things we don't realize is everybody's not saying the same thing in their frustration. So I wanted to make sure I hear everyone. And to me, that's the tradition of Martin Luther King Jr. That's the tradition of all the great peacemakers. We never had this run to the cameras, just voice our anger without a plan and a process.
Right.
By the time Martin Luther King met with Rosa Parks, they'd already had the bus boycotts planned out. People had a direction for their anger. Mm-hmm. If you don't have direction for anger, because that's why the Bible says, be angry but sin not.
Right.
If you don't have a direction and a funnel for that anger, it spills out over everybody. And my heart was breaking for all those young people, black and white, were out there protesting, and some being arrested. Mm-hmm. And so now, for the rest of their lives, they'll have that on their record. It'll hinder them from perhaps being all they could be. And so if someone had just voiced a plan while they voiced the frustration.
You're right. So
we've got to come together. And any oppressed people, God always has them come together. The only reason God allows the oppression is so that you come together.
Yeah.
Sometimes we are bonded by our struggle. and African Americans and white people who care,
Right.
and minorities
Allies.
who care.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to bond together over this struggle
Yeah.
and figure out what can we do that's concrete. You see, this is just like any other death. People are grieving. And we all know that when people grieve, some grieve with anger,
Yes.
some are quiet. And so I want us to stop criticizing folks who stay silent. They're hurting just as much as you. I want us to stop criticizing those who do violent things. That's all the emotional resource that they have. What we have to do is let people grieve. Try to encourage them to grieve in a healthy way. And then figure out what can we do together
Yeah.
that we can all agree on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you know, when you go to funerals, they say to the family, the funeral director always says that, sometimes the pastors do, they say, everybody will be around for the next week
Mm-hmm.
and the next 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
But when this family really needs you is 6 months from now.
Right.
And so what I'm searching for is a group of people that I can join with 6 months, a year, and 5 years from now, that we can come together with a plan and a process so that when and if this does happen again, we can come together and say we do X, Y, and Z.
Right. Right.
How do we get laws changed? How do we get people in place who will really make an impact and keep their promises of peace? I think that's kind of what we do. So there is a discussion to be had,
Yeah.
but there's a discussion that needs to be followed up with action.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm not going to be a part of any more forums to just talk about stuff.
Yeah.
I'll be a part of a planning session.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you want to plan? We have great minds in our community. The same people that help companies sell products across the country
Yeah.
can help sell the idea of peace.
No, I think that is. I think that's absolutely right, and I think it is the next steps in having a plan. To your point, things didn't really start to happen in Montgomery until they began to hit folks in the pocket.
Right.
When they saw that those dollars were drying up, because we are, as we saw with COVID. The money started drying up. All of a sudden, COVID, the pandemic wasn't a big deal. Let's open everything back up. So money, unfortunately, money talks. And we as a community, we have a wealth. We together as a collective, we do a lot of spending. So we need to make sure that part of that plan is a action of how do we begin to withhold those dollars until we see the change that we need to happen.
And that even extends to Elijah. Elijah buys a lot of video games. And wherever your dollars go, you've got to make sure that those dollars are pouring back into the things that you care about.
Absolutely.
And so I would love it if our young people said, video game company, what are you doing
Right.
to help all these young black men and black women who are buying your video games? America always wraps spending money around patriotism.
Absolutely.
4th of July, you got to get your new flag shirt and buy fireworks and all of this. Well, my patriotism, my vote of my dollar is going to be only connected to places that realize that I am a human being.
Absolutely.
With human rights.
Absolutely.
That deserves to be treated fairly.
Right.
And so if we could just do that, and as you say that, I think about the fact that maybe God has been using this pandemic to train people who care. Because we were very focused about how we spent our money.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's exactly right. I think, the other part of that whole thing is, I think part of the pandemic too was to make us united and strong, right?
Right.
And let's not forget about our allies. So we've got, some of these pictures that we've been seeing with the chains being formed by some of our white allies. Even in our family, we stepped outside, and there's a great drawing on our sidewalk from our neighbor that says it talks about love, and this beautiful picture of a rainbow. And it reminds me that we've got lots of allies out there, and what we need our allies to be doing in this moment is speaking out and voicing. A wrong is a wrong.
Right.
I don't necessarily need you not to see color. I need you to see my color.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I want you to be able to say a wrong is a wrong, and stand, for our pastor friends who don't look like us. Tell your congregations too, right? Because I know at one point you were invited to this panel, and I guess to talk about some of that stuff.
I mentioned that in my sermon earlier.
Right. That's right.
And that is true. We definitely have to, for my white friends, and you know my heart. And I said some very pointed things this morning. I need for you to speak to the resources that you have, and remind them that you care about people of color. Remind them that it's important to you. I noticed that my white brothers and sisters tend to be very patriotic when it comes to law enforcement, and I think African Americans too. We need to embrace and hold accountable law enforcement. But to my white friends, when you're calling them heroes and you're shaking their hands, also tell them, keep caring about my brothers and sisters of color. If you would just say that, because when they encounter my son, they'll remember that everybody cares about him. And it'll be your voice, you telling that family member who's in law enforcement, you telling them to make sure that you are fair. And that's the thing, I'm not asking for anybody to cut Elijah any unfair breaks. Just be fair with my son. Hide him behind that shield that you wear on your chest. And so your voice might be heard more than mine. I'm saying this again to my white friends. Your voice will have more impact, because people tend to think, oh, there's another black man and he's paranoid or whatever. But your voice does matter. What you say may stay with them longer. And I understand this while I'm saying this to my white friends who are in law enforcement. I know you just want to get home safe to your family too. And so I understand all the pressures that are on you, and the stress that's in your heart. And so I continue to pray for you. And if there's any way I can be an advocate to you staying safe, I will do that. But I need the same from you. But just like you want to get home safe to your families, I want my son, my wife, to get home safe to me. And that's what we have in common. And if we can work towards that, that's the beginning. And we've got to really start this thing, or we'll be enduring it again.
So as we look to close this episode of Sunday Inspiration, I'll ask you first, and then I'll ask Elijah. Any final thoughts?
Well, your usual question is, where have you seen God today? And so I'll definitely co-sign. I want to say thank you to Kate and Jimmy, our neighbors. Just got to be the best neighbors in the world. And they put their daughters put these loving collages on our sidewalk. And it means a lot to know that somebody cares. No, it didn't change any laws, and it won't bring George Floyd back. But it means a lot to know that there are more with us than against us. I also see God today because my son is still here. He has love in his heart. Doesn't have any hatred for anyone. And the fact that he's lived through school shootings and pandemics and abuse by law enforcement, and he still loves people, and he still treats everyone with the same kindness. That's a miracle.
Oh yeah.
And so that's where I see God.
Yeah. Awesome. Elijah, any final thoughts?
Well, I was going to say our neighbors as well, but I think Dad got it.
Yeah, it was really
nice of them.
Yes. I know Dad took all of ours because I was going to say the same thing. But I also say, because yes, I do get to sit here with my family, and they are safe and they are sound, and that is truly where I see God, and I also see the outpouring of support from our allies has just been overwhelming, and people speaking up has just been tremendous. So with this episode of Sunday Inspiration, just like all of them, our intent is to really start a discussion. So we really want to hear from you, especially with this situation, on what do you think should be the appropriate next steps as we prepare to continue and move on. And so one of the things that we know is, we say this is a marathon. This will not be resolved in the next week, in the next 2 weeks. So we want to do those things that we know, like training, to make sure that we've got the endurance to make it to the end of this marathon. So we would love for you to put into the comments your thoughts about how we could get together to create a plan to move forward. Now, again, like I said earlier, I know it's probably hard to have some inspiration, but always remember that God is still God. He is still able. He is still on the throne, and God can change hearts. So we will continue to lean on and trust God to be the heart changer that we know that He is. So thank you all first to my guests for joining me today, and thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Sunday Inspiration. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye.